Hello everyone and welcome to the Frankly Speaking video series on youth participation. Today we are talking with Cristina Bacalso, youth development researcher, and with her we are going to explore a little bit of difference between adolescents and young people, how the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced youth development and youth participation, and in general why is evidence-based policy making important. Join us.
My name is Cristina Bacalso. I'm currently an independent research consultant on adolescent youth development, like you had mentioned. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, but I'm originally from Canada. So I've been in Europe now for nearly over 10 years and in Berlin specifically for about 7. And prior to my work as a research consultant, I was the research coordinator for Youth Policy Labs, which is a globally focused think tank focused on youth and policies that's here in Berlin. My background is in public policy as well as international development. So a lot of my work, while also operating pretty actively in the European youth space, is also within the development work youth space as well too. So looking at development aid and international frameworks within the United Nations and other global frameworks that focus on youth development in the global south. I would say it's a development that's come across in the last few years, and I partly pushed by kind of a few different things that have happened in youth research. So UNICEF, which is typically associated with kind of early childhood, but actually their focus is all of childhood, and given sort of, you know, the definition from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that kind of thing. Typically when we think of them, we think of, okay, small children, early childhood. But in the last few years, they have actually started to perhaps pivot a bit their focus on a older cohort of children, which is called adolescents. And this was brought on by some advances in brain research, as well as the launch of the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Development, or Health and Wellbeing. And here it was really about looking at the ideas of, okay, many of our child rights organizations have globally put a lot of focus on early childhood, and you know, sort of kind of broadly speaking, when we look at the MDGs and now the SDGs, there actually have been a lot of gains that have been made in terms of early childhood development and health markers and these kinds of things. And the idea was, okay, well, perhaps, you know, let's look at how do we secure these gains, because a lot of, you know, these small children are now sort of developing into older children. What happens then as they get into the ages of 10 to 18 in this area? And a lot of the research has shown that the developmental stage of 10 to 18 in terms of what happens to sort of brain development, but also physiologically, but also primarily socially, in terms of how that position of that young person changes in society, in their families, and identity formation, all of these sorts of things. So all the developmental markers for this age of 10 to 18 were actually now starting to have a greater importance. They saw that the changes that a young person goes through in the adolescent age is perhaps just as important and also just as rapid as what you see in the early childhood development stage. And so there was a bit of a shift in terms of thinking, okay, you know, now we have to also think about this really critical moment when many things are happening, where we see that perhaps a sort of blanket approach to children under 18 is not really going to work. Let's now sort of focus in specifically on this age. And so adolescence as being becoming more of a focus for UNICEF, and also then through my work with UNICEF as a consultant and also during Youth Policy Labs, was sort of where the youth and adolescent overlap started to begin. Because I think that the child rights and the child development community is now starting to look to kind of the youth development community, which often, strangely doesn't have a lot of interaction in a lot of ways, but now starting to think, from this life course perspective, okay, we know we're talking about transitions. We know that we're thinking about what happens when young people age out of school, age out of social care. What do we need to consider for that pivotal time and age? And so it's interesting that my work has also brought me to looking at this idea of adolescence, as well as this overlap with youth and that background there. In terms of the differences between the ways that adolescents and youth participate and if they're motivated by different things or not, I would say not necessarily from the adolescent or youth perspective. I would say that a lot of their motivations do come from a desire to play a role in their community, to have their voices heard, to be able to kind of shape a future world that they would like to live in. What I would say is actually the difference is perhaps the other way in terms of how sort of adult society views them. And that would be also in terms of the attitudes of adult people, but also the way our institutions treat them and the way that our laws and our policies treat them. And this is largely because of this kind of age of majority, 18, that we have here. When you're less than 18 or younger than 18, there is perhaps more of a focus on the protection of a young person. So if you have children who are between 10 and 18, so they're not yet an adult and they're participating, there's a lot more from certainly the child rights community that's, worried, okay, well, we also have to protect them. And I mean, also rightly so. There are reasons for younger children are going to be more vulnerable. And I think, but the tension between protection and participation, you see much more starkly for this age group because they don't have the same kinds of sort of legal rights as older youth do once they've already graduated high school, once they're already over 18. And so this sort of translates into a lot of ways for, this tension between adolescents who want to go to a protest and perhaps parents who don't want them to, adolescents who want to protest in their schools and, and leave class as a sign of protest. And, the fact that perhaps there are school policies or even, municipal or national policies that prevent them from doing so because, the sort of the school rights trump the individual rights of young people. And so, there is much more of that tension. And I think that our community, our youth research community, sometimes grapples with that distinction because when they're younger than 18, we don't tend to, their society doesn't treat them as having citizen rights yet. Even though 18 in a lot of ways is just simply an arbitrary number. But yet we do see many instances of children and young people younger than 18 who are exercising rights as citizens. And so I think in that way, it's a lot more of a conflictual type of relationship. We see in some ways that it's riskier. We see young people who take those risks to participate, to go to protests when they're under 18, perhaps it's a greater risk. But I think that it's also a really important sort of conflict area for us to look at in terms of how do we balance those two rights, their right to be protected as well as their right to participate. Interesting because, if we sort of step back for a moment and think about the ways in which this pandemic is having very specific impacts on young people. So we know, of course, that the immediate health emergency, the immediate health threat of COVID is not, as we so far can tell, is not as dramatic on young people as it is, for example, the elderly and those who are immunocompromised. We know that young people are certainly susceptible to it, are able to get infected, but perhaps are not going to be the ones in society who are going to become the most ill, or, you know, sort of the most impacted by it in that way. However, what we see, if we to consider, is that actually the government responses and the government policies with respect to COVID are the ones which perhaps are going to be having a disproportionate effect on young people. So we can think about the containment measures in particular in terms of the fact that young people, and throughout the world, we have, I think, 1.8 billion young people who were taken out of schools due to nationwide school closures. You know, so that has a huge impact in terms of learning trajectories, in terms of their own sort of cognitive development, as well. You know, not even to mention young people who are unable to graduate or who have their graduation delayed and looking to sort of start their new working lives, that impact that it has on it. And, you know, and that's very much related to the overall economic impact which we're having, both due to, you know, to the fact that we have so many people who are falling ill from this, but also, of course, due to the containment measures. We see the IMF is projecting a global contraction of about 2% to our global economy in 2020. And so we can already see the fallout from this. The OECD had measured that more than 1 in 6 young people had lost their jobs during this period. And for those who are still working, they had their hours dramatically reduced. And so, you know, young people already in economically precarious positions are going to be hardest hit from this economic crisis. For many of them, they are perhaps already working in informal sectors and in the informal economy, and those are primarily getting hit, but also do not have the same type of social security supports that more regular employment would have. So that's also another double disadvantage for young people. And also too, just the consideration that a lot of young people are going to be transitioning out of high school at this time, or are in the beginning of their working careers, and they simply can't find work. So there's a whole background to how, you know, while young people perhaps are not immediately affected by the health shock, are going to have medium and long-term effects in terms of their overall development. We can think about sort of 2 aspects of youth participation as it relates to the current pandemic. We can think about youth participation during the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected young people's ability to participate. But then we can also think about youth participation in decisions about how we are going to be, you know, responding to the pandemic. And I think that those are 2 related but separate questions. The first about youth participation under COVID. I mean, it's quite interesting because in the beginning with the containment measures, we saw protests such as, you know, Fridays for Future shifting and going online. You know, and so, and in some ways we expected, okay, you know, that was probably going to happen. We can see that a lot of young people adapted very quickly in terms of their campaigning methods and their organizing methods. And there certainly is some impact that's going to be had on that in terms of young people's ability to meet in person, to collectively organize, that kind of thing. However, of course, we do have these online tools, and it shows that despite the restriction on meeting in person, young people were still continuing to participate and to organize. Now, what's interesting is actually the anti-racism protests, which have now come up after the police brutality in the United States, the protests there, as well as the protests around the world, including here in Berlin. We actually saw that despite social distancing measures, a lot of young people included, as well as, you know, protesters in general, decided to go out and protest regardless. So what we see here is that youth participation has not been dampened by the pandemic, and actually for a lot of very big issues that young people feel very strongly about, they are simply taking the risk participating in these protests. And so I think that that is a very big aspect for us to think about in terms of COVID having this, this impact on young people, is that despite the risk, young people are still also feeling that they need to engage on certain issues. Here in Berlin, we had, I think it was projected about 60,000 people in the streets. And so it's certainly something that can't be ignored. Now, when it comes to participation in decisions about COVID, this is going to be the topic of a forthcoming article that I'm writing for Salto PI. And the article is really focusing on the degree to which young people actually had a say or had some ability to give input into school closure decisions. So we know that it happened very quickly across the world, sometimes within the span of a week, from when a closure was proposed to when students were told to stay home. And they had a lot of, there was a lot of impact in terms of teaching methods, in terms of what happened with their exams, all these kinds of things. And so that essay will really look specifically at this concept of, we have an emergency, certainly, and there are measures that need to be taken, but what is the room within that still for young people to have some say? And so far in my initial interviews, in part with OBESU board members, as well as some other high school students that will be forthcoming, we're starting to look at the idea that actually a lot of participation really happened on a micro scale. It was young people, not being able to necessarily have that much of an impact on the national dictate to close the schools, but really, relying on individual professors and individual teachers to have conversations with them about, how does this work schedule work for you? How are you feeling during this time? And how can, let's talk about maybe adjusting the workload because of, the stress that we're under right now because of these new circumstances. And I think that that's a really interesting part of youth participation, where we sort of see that interaction of students being able to give their input into, to shaping that. Youth participation in decisions about COVID is still under development. I mean, not only is COVID still quick moving, but I think that governments have been prone to, in this kind of emergency decision-making mode, sort of fast-tracking this idea that, perhaps we don't need public consultation. And I think it's precisely under emergency that we need public consultation, with youth being a large part of that. We see a huge number of surveys, for example, that are out there from social care institutions, from different academics, universities, that are asking young people directly, okay, what are your experiences? How do you feel? What are your prospects for the future? How is COVID impacting you? And I think that all of that creates quite a lot of insight and knowledge for us to know about the experiences of young people. But I think what we see less of is how will that translate into affecting policy? How are we creating that bridge? Or perhaps how can we create structures where young people can give more input into the policy themselves, not simply just into expressing their own views and their own experiences with COVID? And I think that that is perhaps the missing key. That is really the next step that we need to focus on. My frankly speaking message, I think I would have to say, and I think working from the evidence-based policymaking field, I would really have to say that we need to take that seriously. And in the sense of again, not thinking simply about generating evidence, but finding how do we better consolidate that pipeline between evidence and how it impacts policymaking. I think that us as researchers, we're really good at understanding the lives of young people. We're really good at using different types of methodologies and techniques to be able to capture that. But I think that the part where it comes to actually having some influence, having policymakers who are attuned to listening to those messages, perhaps even lobbying and playing that role, getting a greater seat at the table with policymakers, I think is the part that we need to build our capacities on. And I think that understanding evidence uptake, understanding how policymakers are going to be listening to different constituencies, understanding who are those key players that can help to get the ear of the policymakers, you know, those types of assessments, I think is really what's needed for us to think more strategically about how to get youth better on the agenda. Because, you know, as we know, of course, politicians, they play a lot of lip service to caring about young people, but perhaps, you know, I think at the end of the day, young people are often left off of the political agenda and put to the side. And I think that, you know, we know a lot about young people, we're the researchers on it, but we need to think more about how do we mobilize the evidence and the knowledge that we have to actually have an impact, and to how do we measure that impact as well too. I think that's really important. So yeah, we have to get more serious about the policy making side of evidence-based policy making.